listeners. Welcome to what is potentially the juiciest episode of Chasing the Vision yet. I think that there's going to be something in this episode for everyone who is listening in. So we are talking about family businesses and the dynamics that come with that. So again, this episode, this whole series is in partnership with Exit Strategies. We have JT Kraai here and Violand Management Associates. We have Tim Hull joining us. We are on episode 10. So if you've missed any episodes in the series, you can go to cnrmagazine.com and find them there. You can find them on YouTube. There's tons of socials. I know they're being shared on everyone's social pages. You can kind of find them anywhere. Your favorite podcast platform, that's another one. So you can catch up on all of the episodes up till here. We've talked about a lot of different topics related to running a restoration company or kind of any company in general. So, all right, Tim and JT, welcome back to the conversation. I am very excited to be talking about family businesses this time. This is an industry full of family businesses. So Tim, I'm going to have you kind of kick this one off and share a little bit about like the background of family businesses in our industry and the US in general.
Yeah, family business is a big deal, and we deal. I say we deal with it with most of our clients. Research shows that 90% of all small businesses in the U.S. Are a family-owned and operated business, and what's even more staggering is that of those firms, 60% of that population have more than one generation or family member in the business. So it's a huge deal. And it makes a lot of sense, but there's a ton of considerations there. So when you're dealing with a family business, there's a lot to think about. Is this a legacy organization that we're dealing with? Is the family the business? Is the business the family? What's going on there? Because a lot of times that has a tremendous impact on how those family members that are operating in the business view their roles. Things like boundaries and expectations that people have. I like to say businesses are just like families. They're both dysfunctional. And that's not necessarily a good thing in a lot of ways. But you've got that family dynamic that kind of plays itself out in the business, and you've got the business dynamic that plays itself out in the family, and you've got just a plethora of potential issues to deal with, not the least of which things like communication. I mean, communication is hard enough when you have people with a boss subordinate relationship to begin with, but when the boss and the subordinate are husband and wife or father and son or father and mother and daughter, I mean, it makes it even more of a mess. Things like work-life balance. Is there a separation? Is there not a separation? Are we not going to talk about business when we go home? Or is it just a free-for-all? Who knows? And then, lastly, you got the old succession plan. What's going to happen to this thing when mom and dad decide to hang it up, or the father wants out and the mother wants in, and there's just a lot of different things there. So it's a great topic, Michelle, and I'm very eagerly anticipating some of the discussion today. So.
I am as well. JT, anything you want to add to that and kind of defining family business? I'm going to add one tidbit for people who are listening. Keep in mind that family businesses can be any size. In our industry, there's, very small businesses up to like the ATI, for example. I know that they have backers and they're not necessarily family owned anymore, but they are still family run. And that's a massive company with multiple generations and brothers and other people involved. So you can run the full spectrum of a size of a company and still have a lot of family involved. So this can affect any company no matter the size. So, okay, JT, go ahead.
Sure. Well, Michelle, you opened with the term juiciest topic, and then Tim, you added clarity by saying, what's going on there? Well, between juiciest and what's going on, there's a lot of material here. So, and Tim, you covered a lot of great points. I'll summarize what I think Tim is saying. And in my words, families can ruin the best of turkeys at Thanksgiving with a business discussion. And it comes down to this separation and commingling, and it's very real, and it happens in most families. And Tim just gave us a great overview of that. But in restoration, it's 24/7, and the challenge is you work with somebody all day, you solve all sorts of problems together, you come home at night, you're still solving problems together, and oftentimes there isn't this separation. So it is a hot potato, and it can be exhausting. And if it's managed properly, it can be fantastic. And if not, the results can be devastating. So I'm looking forward to diving in a little bit.
Yes. Okay. All right. So JT, kind of keeping with you, there's lots of pros and cons to being in a family-run business. But let's start with the pros. Let's start positive. Keep it positive for a minute. So, what are some of the pros of being part of a family business or running a business where there's multiple members of a family involved?
Yeah, great question. One of the biggest pros is you've got a second owner's mindset or a third. You know, we all know that another owner's mindset is really difficult to get. You know, owners will call people, Tim and I, and they'll say, I can't find good help. They don't work as hard as I do. And well, guess what? They're employees. They're probably not expected to work as hard as you. But when you've got a spouse who you trust and you're all rowing the same direction, it's a really big pro. I mean, it's a nice feather in your cap, especially when it comes to tracking money in the office and the control of the money and communication with key relationships. And sometimes you don't want to just trust anybody with those. But if you've got a spouse, and I don't mean to stereotype, but in this industry, a lot of times he is in charge of production and all things operations, and she is in charge of all things office and money. And it can be a great combination. A lot of successful businesses are built that way. And one of those roles is not necessarily more important than the other. But so it's that's in my world, that's one of the biggest pros is you've got at least two people, husband wife team, and then introduce junior and sometimes junior spouse. So you can have 3 or 4 or 5 people all row in the same direction. Doesn't come without its challenges, which is what we're going to talk about, but it can be a very, very efficient way to run a business.
Yeah. Tim, anything you want to add to that? The
Oh,
pros of family business?
yeah, I mean, there's two big things that come to my mind, Michelle and JT. I think you brought up a lot of good points. Trust and loyalty to being the two big ones that are the benefits that I see. I mean, let's face it, guys. We're not breeding athletes here, so it's not like we're taking the two best athletes and combining things. We don't just because you're part of blood lineage of a business owner or an entrepreneur doesn't mean that the automatic assumption is that the husband, the wife, the brother, the son, whoever is just as brilliant of a business mind as somebody else. I mean, these are pretty much everyday people, and in a lot of ways, when you're family in a business, sometimes those positions can be replaced with other individuals at sometimes a lower cost and to do things more effectively. But the family is the business is the family. The two things that are indispensable, in my opinion, are trust and loyalty, and then long-term stability to the strategic plan. Right, with the trust and stability first. Um, Unfortunately, we work at the privilege of the people who write our paycheck. In a lot of ways, that loyalty goes just that far. And the next paycheck that comes along that's bigger, the greener pastures on the other side of the fence. You don't have that, lifetime of loyalty that you used to have, maybe in a different era where somebody stays with the business long term. But when it's a family business and the family is committed to the business, you've got that trust and loyalty. That's bestowed by birth. That's in your blood. And that kind of follows through with the commitment to the long-term vision and stability of the business. If you've made that commitment and you're in the business for the long haul, as a family member, it's in your best vested interest to make a commitment to that vision because that is your future. It's not just somebody else's future, but now it's yours. So those two things, in my opinion, are indispensable, Michelle, and they are definitely the highlight reel of having family in the business.
So, Tim, keeping on this conversation, how do the dynamics change when there are multiple generations involved? I mean, we've talked about husband and wife teams, but once you start getting the kids involved, and then you talked about the different levels of talent, that can bring different dynamics in as well, trying to decide who's probably in what seat. Aunts and uncles, siblings to the owners, what have you. What are some additional pros as you expand out? And do you reach a point where it becomes like too many people in the family and we need to go back the other way?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as much as we like to have that anti-nepotism clause in our all of our handbooks, I think everybody does. there are times when you come across the best possible person to take this position is a family member. And it may not be an immediately family member of the owner, but maybe it's the husband or the wife of an existing employee, and then you get that family dynamic to it. So there's a lot going on there. I knew we were going to talk about this. I did a little research just on our own client base, and right now we have 115 active engagements with firms throughout the U.S., Canada, and Australia. So I dug into that a little bit deeper. And currently, I was surprised that only 14 of those, so about 12% of the engagements that we've got, involve multi generations in the business.
Hmm.
So to me, multi-generational situations bring a degree of complexity that can be um, overreaching to the whole organization. Because you guys have all seen that situation where you have the person that's got the perceived golden spoon or silver spoon in their mouth. They're the heir apparent, they're the son, they're the daughter who's eventually going to take over the business. That can be effective if, in fact, they are qualified to do that. So, I guess the sticking to the pros on this one, Michelle. The most effective way that I've seen that done is through a gauntlet of education and really a commitment to earning those positions. So a lot of business owners, to their credit, will tell their sons, their daughters, their whoever, I'd like you to go out work for another organization. Go spend some time, 2, 3, 4 years, work for somebody else. With the last name that isn't ours,
Yep.
and learn what it's like to have accountability, to earn your way, earn your promotions, earn your wage that you have there. But more importantly, learn about the business from a different perspective. And when they come back into the business and it's time to kind of fill that seat, then they have not only that other experience to draw on, but also they've got the respect of the current individuals that are there. So Johnny didn't just come into the business and the chair was there sitting, waiting for him to sit in it. He earned that spot. And there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah. Yep. That makes good sense. JT, anything you want to add about the dynamics of adding more and more of the family?
Well, not necessarily more and more. I've seen up to 9 family members in a business, and they're sizable, 70, 80 employees, that can be good and bad, of course. And managing expectations are key. We'll might talk about that shortly. But I want to highlight a word that Tim used over and over in the last couple answers, and he used it in the best way possible. It's commitment. And when we're dealing with families and they're committed, there's so many wonderful options. If for some of these family members, these positions are placeholders or they're sort of charity positions that they're in between jobs, we added these, for Johnny, we'll use that name again. Then it can be tough. Expectations and entitlement, everything gets commingled. When family is committed to doing the right thing and it's a long-term focus, everything gets a lot easier. The answers come easier. In fact, they're desired. And so commitment over placeholder positions is what I like to say. With that in place, everything's much better.
Okay. All right. So, all right, we ready to jump to the cons of family business? I feel like this is one of those topics where the bad people automatically think of the bad things versus the good things when it comes to family businesses and the stress and whatever that can come with it. But Tim, I'll toss it to you first. What are some of the biggest challenges that you see family businesses face?
Oh, well, big, I think, is a relative word, Michelle. So I'm going to go with most common. How's that?
Most common, yes. Most
Because
common
they
is
can all
better
be
than good.
they can all be impactful in different ways. But I mean, look, I said it before, families and businesses are both dysfunctional. And to me, blood and disobedience kind of go hand in hand in family businesses. You're always going to have sibling rivalries. You're always going to have issues that play out in someone's marriage that trickle down into the business and vice versa. So there's a lot of things that come to the table, but I guess the highlight reel that we see, the first most common one is conflict. So if you've got conflict at home, whether it's recent conflict or conflict that happened years ago as a result of your upbringing or something that happened as a child, and those relationships, they kind of play themselves out in business. So seeing that is pretty common. Unfortunately, it gets masked because a lot of times it's conflict avoidance, right? Let's say a son and a father. Father's the owner of the business currently, and the son's the successor in grooming. And there's things that, maybe the son was never good enough for the dad throughout his whole life. He's just trying to live up to an expectation. Well, that conflict is always existing. And they'll get into business discussions about critical things in the business, and that conflict gets avoided. The son can have the best recommendation for the situation in the world, but because the father's always looking at it as the son not being good enough, and I'm thinking of one client in particular, by the way, he'll always suppress that idea. The issue isn't the idea, Michelle. The issue is the problems that the father and the son had with his upbringing that are playing themselves out in the business, and that affects everybody. Of course, that filters down into communication too, and communication in a lot of ways. There's more communication, believe it or not, at least from what we see, between family in the business than what we would typically see if you didn't have family in the business. I mean, they're talking about business all the time, but therein lies another problem that when they go home at night and they're cooking dinner and say, "Oh yeah, you've got to call so and so because he called, he wants to pay his bill tomorrow," or so and so said he wants to call off on Friday and you need to. So these comments get made in passing, but there's no formality there for the exchange of information. So while it's frequent, it's not necessarily effective. The last one that we see a lot of times is this misunderstanding of roles and responsibilities in the business. And really, to me, that stems from, especially when you've got family that is equity owners in the business, whether that's a husband and wife or maybe a brother partnership situation where you've got somebody that's filling a functional role in the business. Maybe the one brother is the president or, vice president of whatever department in the organization. Then you've got another brother who's a project manager or he's out leading the operations department. And you see these individuals kind of misunderstand the difference between ownership and their responsibility in their respective roles. So they have a tendency to kind of overstep their bounds, make decisions, maybe even contradict the other individuals, the other family members' decision on something with an employee because they're a quote unquote owner. There's the whole mess of issues that come about on that one.
Okay. JT, what do you want to add here on the cons?
I'm just smiling because there's a whole textbook in here. There really is. This could probably be a 3-part series on family, but I'll add a couple things, 3, I think. And I'm going to address it from a transaction standpoint because that's kind of my world. And one of the most common challenges I see when kids are involved in the business is that new ideas get introduced. Mm-hmm. Okay, parents have been doing it a certain way for 20, 25 years. Why fix it if it isn't broken? Who are you to come into the business and start giving me ideas? And typically these can be around software, technology, or just changes in the industry. And oftentimes they're good recommendations, but there's this hesitancy to change. And so this risk of change is it's kind of a threat to the way it's always been done. And let's face it, there's some real significant advances in the industry the last 10 years. And I don't blame the kids for wanting to make change. I don't blame the parents for wanting to keep doing it, but that can be a real conflict. So that's one issue. The second that I commonly see is parents who really can't let go. And maybe the formal way of saying that is Tim's explanation on maybe they don't view the son or daughter as being good enough or capable enough, or that they don't have enough experience. And that decision just might not land well with the company. And so parents who kind of helicopter some of these decisions, that's fine, I think, for a few years through a mentorship period and getting a son or a daughter up to speed. But at some point in time, I'll say it's very frustrating for everybody. And it can tear a family apart and a business apart rather quickly. So parents need to be aware of why decisions are being made and whether it's them not letting go or the capability and ability of a son or daughter. And I think that's key. And then lastly, there can be, and I don't know if we're thinking about the same client, Tim, there can be a real sense of entitlement at times. And Tim used the example of a chair sitting there waiting for them. Mm-hmm. And it's real. And a lot of times with when somebody comes into the business, there is that entitlement with being paid a little bit more, having a few extra benefits, getting a new truck every year as opposed to every third or fourth year. It might be a PM or an estimator. And that sense of entitlement can really wreak havoc with your culture. And people from the outside of the family looking into the family and looking at that potential nepotism. So that's a real threat. And when you put those three in a bucket and start to stir it up, that has to be navigated carefully. So I think it can be navigated successfully, but I think, Tim, you mentioned that there needs to be a boatload of education and getting those expectations on the table for that to be successful.
Is it ever possible, specifically in the area of maybe there's a conflict going on amongst the family in a business, that does not affect the rest of the business? Is it possible for there to be any level of conflict and somehow it does remain isolated?
I guess it's possible, Michelle. Yeah, I think it's possible. The unfortunate side of that is there's always symptoms. At least in my opinion, from what I've seen. JT, maybe your experience is different, but there's something going on that's unspoken. Yeah. And that, in negotiation, we call that the black swan. That's a kind of a takeoff of Chris Voss's stuff. But when you've got that emotionally charged motivating factor that's kind of playing out in the background, but it's unspoken, you got to get it out. Otherwise, even if it doesn't involve the business issue at hand, it's always in the way. So is it possible? Yes. Is it possible that it doesn't affect the business? That's pretty hard. That's pretty hard in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'd say it's possible, rare, but possible. Mm-hmm. And to me, it comes down to respectful communication. And here's an example. I just started valuing a company that's doing about 35 million a year. The owner is almost 70. He's been grooming his son for the last 30 years, 35 years, I suppose, to be in the business. And the son really wants to take over. And I don't know that it's going to happen. And the son is to the point, I just found this out on Monday, actually. The son is to the point now where he's so frustrated, he just threatened to move out of state. And this will totally destroy the parents who their only plan has been their son. And this I found out from the father, and he said it just can't happen. He said, I understand my shortcomings in this. I understand what led to this, but there's a sense of relief there when the dad talks about it, and there's also a sense of terror, because there could be resolution one way or the other. And having a respectful line of communication with some of these events, Tim said it a couple times, it's what's not being said that affects everything. These issues have to get on the table in order to be solved. They're absolutely not going to solve themselves.
Yeah, JT, can we go, Michelle, are we okay to go down in that rabbit hole for a little bit?
Yep, absolutely.
Because I think it brings up something that wasn't necessarily on our agenda for today, but it's a great point, because I've come across this a couple different times, JT, and the situation you're describing where you've got that son or daughter that is going to take over the business or supposed to take over the business. A lot of times that transition starts to occur very early, and before any exchange of discussion is had about is the son or daughter going to buy the business from the parents, and if so, what's that look like? I had one that sticks out in my mind that we ended up, it took 3 years almost to kind of navigate that terrain. But the son was taking over the business from the parents, and the parents did a pretty good job of building a good business, but the son had a vision for the business that was well beyond where the parents were. I thought the business could go, or were even capable of taking it there. Well, he had already started down that road, and the business grew substantially. So when it came time to talk about buying the business from the parents, there was a lot of resentment there. with the valuation of the business. And I'm curious to hear how you would approach that situation, because it was a big issue. The son's position was, look, if it weren't for me, the business
Hmm.
wouldn't be worth this today.
Hmm.
But now I'm forced to pay for something that I created.
Hmm.
How do you deal with that?
On an individual basis. There isn't a simple answer for that, Tim. I know earlier in a previous episode you said you don't like the answer. It depends. Well, in this
Mhm.
case, it definitely depends. There are um, special circumstances between gifting strategies, gifting ownership, earning ownership, written or unwritten agreements that the son in this case is going to get X% of the business when it's sold, or if it's going to be taken over, they get it at a reduced rate because of their incentive and growth. It starts with the parents and what their expectation was. Rarely when you have family in the business is it all about the money when you're transitioning to kids. With a successful business, a lot of times the parents have made their money. They don't need a lot of extra money. They'd like some. It's money can be a little bit like Advil. If two is good, four is better, right? It just works better. But when you've got realistic expectations from both sides, typically medium ground can be found. Doesn't come without heartburn. To add to your scenario, now throw in a couple extra kids who are not in the business. And what does that look like? And this is why these family business centers have been created to help navigate all this. And Tim, you and I can help on a pretty high level and even handle some of the conversations down in the weeds. But it is sticky, and it all comes down to expectations and communications. But rarely, without earnest attempts, rarely is a solution not found. I don't think I've been skunked yet on a solution with a family transfer, and I've done dozens of them.
I'm processing all this. It's like this is such a big topic, and I have 20,000 more questions in my head, but I'm going to try to stay the course here. So, okay. All right. So, some of the big pitfalls we've talked about have been communication, handling conflict, clear, defined roles and responsibilities. So, Tim, I'll kick this to you first. How do owners avoid some of these struggles and pitfalls? What have you seen in good companies that have family involved and they just navigate it really, really well?
Yeah, and this is the good side to all these issues, Michelle. There's a lot of help out there, right? So
Mm-hmm.
most colleges, universities, and there's a lot of them in the U.S. They've all got some sort of family business center. They're great resources. They've got awesome information. They have help to offer. Go seek out that education that you need to work through those issues. As professional advisors, we network with subject matter experts. We've worked very closely with organizations like the Family Business Consulting Group in Chicago for many years. Even we get stumped on situations that come up. But the good thing is that there's help available out there. A couple of other tips that we've seen be effective with regard to communication, because that is such a big issue. Sanctify a time and a place to have a meeting. Use an agenda for that meeting. Use, best practices like you would use in business, all in general. But keep the information focused, and that way the transfer of information from one party to the other can be effective in doing that. Another big one for me, dealing with that functional role in the business versus ownership thing. I've got a position, I've got a role to play in the business, but I'm also an equity owner. In my opinion, that scenario should involve two different methods of compensation, right? So my best advice I've always given family business owners is pay your owners as though you were paying an employee to do the functional position in their business. So if they're an estimator in the business, pay them the going rate for the estimator position. If they're keeping the books, then you pay them as a bookkeeper. Any difference can be remedied on a quarterly basis, annual basis with a distribution. Excess profits can be distributed that way. But reserve that for ownership share of the profit, but take your salary and your regular compensation as a functional employee. And then lastly, reach out to somebody that's not related to the situation. It can be a mediator, it can be a consultant, like us, myself, JT. If you need help navigating sometimes we can bring a unique perspective because it's an unbiased approach. We don't have a horse in the race, so to speak, so that we can present the facts in an opinion that's unbiased and make recommendations for what we feel is best in the eyes of the business, not necessarily what's in alignment with somebody's, agenda personally that they have.
Sure. Okay, JT, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah, that was really well said. I don't have a lot to add to that. The only couple of things I will mention is that both parties have to want and accept answers. It's a little bit like going to counseling. And if you sat down with a mediator and one side doesn't like the answer that they're getting, they're going to pull the ripcord and step out. And that's not helpful on any level. But what advisors can provide, these family business centers, Tim, VMA, myself, etc., is we can provide scenarios of what's worked, what hasn't worked. We've seen dozens of these. We can help set expectations. And where we get into trouble is, let's say the son had an expectation of taking over by a certain date and had these sorts of roles and responsibilities, were making these sorts of monies and had these decisions already in place. But none of that was ever voiced. It was all internal. And so this communication, Tim and I can't emphasize it enough, but you've got to want and accept the answers that are available and then navigate between those guardrails for the best outcomes.
Okay, so JT, sticking kind of with you here, in a lot of our episodes, we've talked about the value of the owner or the leadership team in a transaction or in a sale. What happens? How does this change, or how is it affected when it's family that is all in this leadership team, perhaps, or, high up in the company? What if it's everyone's related versus, employees and an owner? Does that change things?
Sure. Well, it can, and it oftentimes does, but I'll approach this from two aspects. Mathematically, when you calculate an adjusted EBITDA, you weight those years, you hit it with 5 to 7 valuation formulas. The math doesn't change. So mathematically, it may not affect the number. Well, we peel back the onion a little bit and start looking at the story. And there's all sorts of questions that need to be asked about the roles and responsibilities of the owners. And are those roles going to continue? Tim mentioned it earlier. Are they overpaid or underpaid for what they do? And will they want to do that under a different buyer? Are they market rates? And would they even be willing to work for market rate if they've been overpaid for so long because that's their new normal? Are there family members who want to retire? If I'm not working for dad, if I'm not working for mom, if I'm not working for Uncle Joe, I don't want to work for anybody else. Well, so now a buyer comes along and you lose all the institutional knowledge of, let's say, mom and dad or Uncle Joe, and the institutional knowledge of a son who's awfully key in the business or a daughter who's awfully key. There's too much talent that can be lost. So yes, that can be devastating. If they're not going to work with another buyer, or if they choose to work with another buyer, what's their career path look like? You get into what I call the industry strategics out there, and those are the VMS cats and the first on sites and the blue sky, the ATI and customs. Their career paths can often be better than what mom and dad can offer. So there's an upside sometimes. And what do those look like? And are there family members that are excited about that? Are there multiple owners in the family business? Who's got equity? Who doesn't? That's a decision. Are they rolling equity moving forward into what we call NewCo, post-close? So there's all these decisions to make, and it can be risky if not navigated right. In fact, that deal can blow up. I've had very entitled kids that have blown up a deal. The buyers come along and start interviewing these key positions that are kids to the parents, and the kids aren't happy. They thought it was their business to inherit. They don't like where this is going because now they're going to be employees to somebody else, not the owner of what was supposed to be, quote, given to them. And it's a terrible place to be. And the example I'm thinking of, the dad started making decisions trying to compensate for the guilt that he felt for his son, who was pissed, quite frankly, and let everybody know about it. And the deal fell apart. And none of this was communicated in advance. And by the time it was brought to my attention, I was trying to put out fires and I couldn't hold the deal together. So, there's plenty of impact to transactions and value. It just has to be navigated carefully.
Yeah. Yeah. Tim, what's your take on this?
Well, I think you bring up a good point with the financial impact side of things, JT, and I wasn't really thinking about it from that perspective. Just I guess in experience looking at some of the clients that we've had that have gone through that scenario, I think buyers are kind of attuned to looking what the replacement cost of an individual is in a business. So from a positive perspective there, Michelle, a lot of times if we have overinflated salaries, let's say, or compensation, we're using it as a vehicle to feed the family trust fund, so to speak. I would like to think that most buyers are akin to the fact that they could replace those individuals, maybe family members, at a lower cost than what they're currently getting paid. So there's a gap there that they get to be able to realize that return on. But at the end of the day, how it has an impact on the sale of the business from a buyer's perspective, I think is very regrettable. I hate to say that, but there's a lot of things that come into play there. The biggest one being is that if you plan on that family being involved in the business post-transaction, you've got about a 6 to 12 month window. The first 6 months is all honeymoon, a bunch of promises, maybe there's rollover equity involved, and everybody's happy, right? And then change starts to go into place. And what happens is the owners, whether they're family that are working for, maybe the parents of the original owner, they see the change taking place, and they feel slighted by that. They feel offended by the fact, who are they to come in and change the way we did things? And so the engagement of those family members wanes very quickly after that, and we quickly see an exit, which fills a void, obviously, in the organization. So it's another issue that the buyers have to deal with. The other one that's more common than not really is as part of the transaction. A lot of times the owners will they will look at their sons and daughters and make them out to be more than what they are in the business, contributors wise. Oh yeah, my son is, he's the heir apparent. I want to go off and I want to play golf for the remainder of my days, but you're in good hands with my son. He's the general manager, or he's the vice president of operations or whatever. And they make him out to be as though he is the turnkey successor. So they lock in post sale employment things. They have performance bonuses, retention bonuses. They have all kinds of stuff in place, only to find out that person is really not performing the way they were sold that person is performing. So we see a change there. But at the end of the day, to me, if I'm a buyer, I'm really not placing a whole lot of value in family being in the business. I'm going to plan. So if there's any seller or buyers out there that are listening to this, I'm going to plan as though I'm not having any one of those family members in the business in another 12 to 18 months. If you're not preparing for that, then I think you're setting yourself up for failure.
Tim, on the flip side, for companies maybe not owners not thinking about selling, but they're growing, what advice do you give those owners who have a spouse or additional family members in the business as they continue to grow?
Yeah, I mean, to me, JT, you brought it up. The expectations thing is just such a huge part of this. Get clear on what everybody's expectations are. We're talking family members and the founders or owners in the business. They have to be real clear on what their intentions are with the business, what their expectations of the other parties are. Because a lot of times the inevitable conflict that we see down the road deals with a misalignment of those expectations, unspoken assumptions about what people are or are not going to do in a business moving forward. So get clear on that.
Okay, that makes good sense. So, all right, JT, what kind of advice do you give businesses who are thinking, or owners that have maybe family in the business and they're thinking about making this transition, especially if maybe they're in a point where nobody else in the family knows that they're thinking about selling or thinking about, it's time to get on that exit ramp per se. What advice do you give these owners that have family in the business that are thinking maybe it's time to make a change?
Well, first, I always recommend let's just talk about it.
Yeah.
What are the expectations? And I'm in the middle of evaluation right now where there's two husband-wife teams. This is multiple location business, two husband-wife teams, and a son and his wife. So there's 6 owners to this. And I've asked the mom and dad what the son's plans are. They have no idea. And I've asked the other couple, they have a daughter who's thinking of coming into the business and wants to for this transition, and they have no idea. So there's all these expectations that are kind of thrown against the wall and seeing what sticks, and yet no one's talking about them. So this communication, I know Tim and I, you've used this word, you and I have used this word about 75 times in the last hour. It needs to happen. It absolutely needs to happen. Without it, we are setting ourselves up for failure. And so and what I mean by expectations is realistic expectations, something that's in the sphere of normalcy, because oftentimes there's an expectation there and it's not anywhere close to what we would consider normal or acceptable to a buyer. So get a few answers, find out what are the boundaries for situations like this, what is possible. And if someone is going to retire, does it mean they're going to retire in 3 months after a sale, or can it be 2 or 3 years? And what is the success? Tim just mentioned that a lot of these 2 or 3 year key employee contracts, they don't make it that far because change does happen and it gets a little too frustrating. And there's other wildly successful success stories where an owner rolls over some equity and, 5, 6, 7 years later, their equity, their partial equity was worth more than their majority equity, 6 years earlier. So it can be very successful. But my best advice is you got to want answers. You've got to be able to accept those answers and communicate them. And it doesn't always have to be a real formal agenda. And Tim, it was perfect advice you said 15, 20 minutes ago about, set aside some time, designate it, dedicate time to this. That's true. And there are other times where you just need to find out what the other person's thinking. Talk to me about what's on your mind. If in this scenario that I'm talking about, I said, go to your son, ask him what he and his wife are thinking. What is the long-term plan? Okay, they're trying to have kids and take over a business. Those two worlds may collide in this case because they both work in the business a lot. Mm-hmm. And so some quick temperature readings also can be very revealing. And it just has to be on the table. My history is that, and I'll say it again, they absolutely do not solve themselves. And if you're waiting for a buyer to help you navigate this and help you put the puzzle piece together, it's not going to end well. It's just too late in the game.
Tim, anything you want to add to that advice to owners who are thinking, I have family in the business and I'm ready for a change?
Well, I'm thinking, every time you were talking, I'm thinking about a different client situation, JT, and one comes to mind in particular. And it was a few years ago where I was working with a client, and the father who owned the majority share in the business came to me and he said, "Hey, I got an offer for the business that I can't refuse." And it was in a neighborhood of about $18 million for the business. And he didn't think it was worth anywhere near that. And he was concerned because his son had been a part of that succession plan. And it was a well laid out plan. I mean, the son had been earning an equity stake in the business as a performance bonus each year. And this kid was knocking it out of the park. I mean, he was performing well beyond expectations that most owners would have of that position, business development position. And he had accounts and he had recurring revenue and all kinds of good stuff. But his dad was operating from a place where he was afraid that if he entertained that offer, his son would be upset because he eventually was going to take over the business. That was the plan. And so we operated from that assumption for several months. And I said, look, you got to talk to your son about this, because this is either this deal's going to happen and he's going to be pissed and it is what it is, or, you'd be surprised. And the hitch in the whole thing, just to kind of cut a long story short, is that to get that kind of money for the business, the buyers wanted security on the employment of the son.
Oh.
So that was the real big linchpin in this whole thing. But when the dad approached the son, he's like, yeah, heck yeah. I'm 28 years old and you're talking about I'm going to put $3 million in my pocket right now, and I have the potential to make X down the road. Yeah, I'll take that deal any day. So it ended up being a non-issue, but we thought it was a big issue. But had they had those conversations from the very beginning, the situation would have gone a lot differently.
Communication is key in everything in business.
Absolutely.
Communicate. Okay, anything that either of you want to add, any more stories, or we could have stories on this one, I'm sure, until we were blue in the face, but anything else family business related that you two want to throw into this one?
Well, this is such a deep topic, Michelle, that I'd put a request out to the listeners that if they'd like to hear some interviews, some testimonials, or even get the firsthand rendition of what we're talking about from folks that we've worked with, please, reach out to us through social media, email. A lot of you have our numbers. Give us a call and say, yeah, we'd like to see those individuals on the show, because I think it could be a lot of fun.
Yes, I totally agree. JT, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, it's an excellent suggestion, Tim. And we might even do a live Q&A at some point. We could do a webinar and have people call in and answer family dynamic questions. It's an emotional topic, and there's not many answers out there from an owner's perspective. So there's a lot of ground to cover here. And if you've got something specific, be more than happy to help. Both Tim and I are qualified to answer some pretty detailed questions, at least offer some confidence and peace of mind for the road ahead.
Perfect. All right, gentlemen. Well, thank you so much. This wraps up episode 10. Again, you can find all of the episodes on CNR's YouTube page, on your favorite podcast channels. I know Exit Strategy shares them and Violand shares them. They're all over the place. You can't miss them. So I look forward to seeing you both on the next episode.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Tim.